Hello, everybody. My name is Tania Perez Cano, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. And I am going to share a PowerPoint today for my presentation. Um, just give me a minute. So my presentation's title is New Weapons for a Greek Goddess, Athena, the first Cuban webcomic in English. This presentation is based on an article that will be published in Spanish in a journal from the Universidad Nacional del Sur in Argentina. So I am going to be using some notes for my presentation. So after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the crisis of the nation state in Cuba, with the transnational turn in Cuban society and culture, Cuba is faced with a deep economic crisis and a complete transformation on its culture practices. For the comic creators and the comic in the island, the massive exodus that Cuba go through in the 1990s affected deeply how the comic was produced. It's a transformation that affected not just the production of the comic, because many publications disappeared due to the economical crisis, but also many of the comic creators emigrated. Many of them who remain in the island went into some kind of internal exile. For example, Orestes Suarez, one of the most important creators in the island, he started publishing for an Italian publication and never got to publish anything else in Cuba. So all these transformations affected deeply how comics were produced in Cuba. Regarding this transformation and these challenges that the comic creators face in the island, it is also important to note that since after the revolution of 1959, the comic was considered an important propaganda tool by the Cuban government. It was considered a very efficient way of reaching people and in educating the population in the new revolutionary ways, and in doing a critique of the bourgeois past, and for example, giving promotion to all the initiative of the Cuban revolutionary government. Also, the comic is seen as a dangerous ideological influence, particularly the mainstream American comic. Superman, for example, is considered a dangerous influence in the Cuban youth. The only character, for example, in which Superman has any kind of presence in the Cuban culture those years is in a parody form as a character named Super Tiñosa, which is a bird that it's the remedy somehow imitates Superman, but always fails in whatever action initiates. So in the 1990s, what we see in Cuba is this crisis in many areas of the Cuban society and the Cuban culture. John Lent, in an article that he publishes in 2009, he explains this crisis, and he, for example, goes through all the names of the Cuban comic creators that left the island, and how those who remain there were doing other kinds of jobs in order to just barely survive. In that moment when Lent is revising the state of the comic industry in Cuba, he sees something that it's true until today, and is the will of the comic creators to overcome these challenges that they were facing, these economical challenges, also censorship, another kind of state control over their cultural creation. However, this transnational turn that it's initiated in the 90s with the emigration of massive immigration of Cuban intellectuals and creators generate new kind of sensibilities, new ways of exchanging between the island and its diaspora, and new ways for artists to legitimize and promote their work. And frequently, those new ways didn't go through the usual channels controlled by the Cuban state. They were not depending anymore on the state or the government in order to promote and commercialize their creation. So one of the some of the topics that are going to be discussing in my presentation is precisely this impact of transnationalization and the economic crisis experienced by Cuba in the last decade of the 20th century, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the socialist European bloc. And at the same time during these years, internet access started to be possible in the island, but with many ways until 2013, this access for most of the population was illegal. It was an access that was not obtained through legal ways. And it definitely impacted the way also in which Cuban creators approach their work. Finally, in 2013, when the use of internet is somehow normalized in the island, this opened up new virtual territories, and it started breaking this long-standing divide that plagued post-revolutionary Cuban culture, that between those in the island and those abroad. However, it is a complex process, and I will be talking more about it. I see Athena precisely as an expression of this complex cultural dynamics between the island and its diaspora. In the fact that the creative process of Athena involved a fragmented communication between the author of the script, that is Daniel Cruces Perez, who remained in Cuba, and Josuan Remolina Amador, Josuan, who emigrated first to Mexico and then to the US. The fact that the creative process had to be done through these not always readily available internet connections, through this fragmentary communication between the two of them, has definitely, it shows how these particular technological conditions in the island had an impact in the creation of these new generations of comic artists in Cuba. It is the first webcomic produced by a Cuban cartoonist. It is the first webcomic written in English by a Cuban cartoonist living in the US. It is also an alternative adult sequential narrative, and it is very clear that it distances itself from the explicitly political or children-oriented comics produced in the island. As we will see, it presents topics like violence, like despair, like it's a very dark narrative, and it's also a complex narrative with intertextual references, that it is definitely something that it's new in the comic scene in Cuba and comic creators abroad. So I said, this kind of adult comic narrative, and particularly that show, for example, sexual violence, are not published in Cuba. Until today, also feminicide is not legally recognized in the island as a sex-based hate crime that targets women. There have been several campaigns by activists asking the Cuban government to recognize this kind of violence against women as a specific form of crime, but so far they haven't been successful. So the fact that the story in Athena starts with this kind of violence against a woman, and the rewriting of the myth of Athena in this kind of violent way shows this different way in assuming and narrating and using the sequential narrative. And I'm going to read one of the first paragraph in how the story start to be told in Athena. So just arrived in the city, Sarah is kidnapped and assaulted by the owner of the motel she's staying in. Unfortunately for both of them, the girl is a reincarnation of the goddess Athena, whose tendencies toward love and violence are a mystery even for Zara. Our story follows the misadventures of Sarah and her acolytes in a world where practically everyone is hostile, but few things are more dangerous than whatever resides inside each person. And in here we see this interaction between Sarah and her attacker. All the first panels of the story are telling the progression of this attack. As we can see, in this scene, Sarah bites his attacker, and from his head emerges the goddess Athena. So we have this character, which is Zara Athena, that then starts going through the city, rescues a little girl who had been kidnapped. And the story gets all this dark and hostile environment in a city that is shown also as a hostile territory. So this is the story that is told in the first volume of Athena. And I will go back to the plot of Athena later. So Athena then is the result of this collaboration between these two artists. They were born in the 1980s in Havana. And this is a generation that saw the fall of all the beliefs and this idea of a socialist future in which a new man would emerge, and the future of the country was pretty much predetermined. And it was this idea that equality and prosperity for all Cubans that obviously failed after the fall of the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc. So in these years, as I said, there were the first attempts to connect the island to internet. And we can see how for Cubans, regular Cubans in the island, the idea of connectivity to internet was related to this idea of modernity, of access to the world, of not being constrained to the island, to have access to what was perceived as a world that was beyond the reach for most Cubans. However, the introduction of internet in the island was received by the Cuban government with suspicion, just in the same way that foreign comics were perceived as a threat for the Cuban government. And Jorge Catalá, who is an academic researcher in comics in the island, he says, for example, this suspicion towards foreign comics had been constructed and fomented during the 1960s by Cuban newspapers, policymakers, and political figures alike. Fidel Castro, in the closing speech of the Revolutionary Youth Students Congress in March 1961, stressed US cultural penetration in Cuba. And he's quoting Castro. He said, "In the past, we read only Yankee American magazines, Yankee books, Yankee news agency reports, Yankee papers, Yankee comics." So this idea of this conflict between Cuba and the US the comics are perceived as a weapon, an imperialistic weapon that can manipulate and influence the minds of young Cuban generations. So similar suspicions are expressed about internet. in a Fidel Castro speech in 1995. And I'm quoting from the speech. The United States speak of information highways, new ways that serve to fortify this economic order which they want to impose on the world through propaganda and manipulation of human mentality. That perspective was reproduced in different layers of Cuban society, mainly in those contexts focused on national security. So this is a conflicting way in which the access to internet was perceived. On the one hand, definitely was identified as a need for the Cuban government, but also there was this suspicion about the threat that the access to free access to internet represented for the government. So that is why this is for until 2013, there was not the only possible access to internet was in some work centers. So it was very controlled, not even paying people had access to it. And that changed in 2013. Even so, the prices are prohibitive for most Cuban citizens, but at least after 2013, most Cubans have access to internet and can communicate with their families abroad. So this, of course, negatively impacted not only the Cuban society in general, but also Cuban culture and particularly comics. So Athena is born in 2006, again, in this fragmentary way of exchange between the two creators, and pretty much taking advantage of this illegal access to internet from this exchange between Daniel Perez in Cuba and Joshua that was in Mexico or the US. They never discussed the creation of Athena in person. It has been always through these means, through internet or phone calls or this media. So I think Athena, it gives us perspective into this post-revolutionary society in Cuba, how Cuba changed in his way of approaching cultural production thanks to internet access and thanks to social media. So this deterritorialized new reality have opened at least some doors for Cubans in the island and abroad to have this kind of creative exchanges. This is an image of Athena being born from the head of Sarah's attacker. As we can see, is exactly a representation of the goddess Athena with all her attributes as a warrior. I have to say that if we look at the many scenes in which the city is represented in Athena, one of the recurring ways in which the city is represented is through ruins. So it's not just like we see this character, this old man that is going around the city in his bicycles looking for his disappeared granddaughter. And when we look at the way in which he interacts, for example, with the police, we see that the abuse that he suffers. We see his despair looking for his disappeared granddaughter. But also we see a general sense of moral despair, of ruins throughout the whole narrative of Athena. We see this hostile environment in which the characters are fighting to survive. And it's interesting that precisely the fight, la lucha, is one of the ways in which Cubans in the 90s refer to everyday life in the island. Everything was a fight against scarcity, a fight to survive. There was no perception of a possible future. There was no certainty about what was going to happen. And so all this violence and despair that we see in Athena, I think is related to this loss that these new generations experience when they realize that these hopes that were placed in the future of the country were simply non-existent anymore. So this image of this old man going through the city, searching for his granddaughter is one of the more, for me, is one of the more important moments in the narrative, because even when the creators say that they are working not with the space of the city of Havana, but in a fantasy city, also they say that they are working with an image of Havana that is in their dreams. That is not really Havana, but the idea is to create this perception of the space of the city of Havana during the crisis. I think they have told me that they tried to express the loss of that experience as a generation, when the symbols and all the value system that they grew up with simply disappear. So there is a phrase that it's repeated in Athena, that it says, "There's nothing here and all there is wrong." I think that this rewriting of the myth of Athena in this violent and disenchanted narrative, it's definitely talking to this kind of loss of paradigms that we experienced in the 1990s and pretty much until all the first decades of the 21st century. This narrative that reconstructs and recreates the myth of Athena, it has its base in this sense of loss. Athena also indeed represents this new form for the Cuban comics, the search for new spaces of legitimizing for Cuban creators. It formulates this allegory that breaks the dichotomy between the in the island and abroad the island, the autochthonous comics versus foreign comics that is being such a constant after the Cuban Revolution. And it opens up new ways to interacting with readers. And also is asking for new ways of readers to approach reading of comics in the Cuban comic scene. So I wanted to finish my presentation going back to this article of Lent, Cuban cartoonists, masters of coping, because at the time when Lent wrote his article, published his article, he was talking about this persistence of Cuban creators to keep producing comics even in the most difficult of context. So he said, lest this reference to cartoonists leaving Cuba be construed as their admitting defeat and therefore negating the opening assertion that Cuban cartoonists will endure, let it be remembered that most artists remain in Cuba and that through their clever work and coping abilities continue the profession's long tradition in the country. And I think John Len's affirmation of 2009 is still true. Cuban cartoonists have endured all kinds of material limitations, all kinds of political, ideological conflicts in the island, but indeed they have persisted in creating ways of creating their art. However, today, cartoonists in the island and abroad have more fluid contacts through social media, and I think choosing to stay in the island or leave that does not constitute anymore a statement of either endurance or defeat, but it simply is a condition of contemporary Cuban culture. And this Athena is precisely, I see it as a proof of these possibilities for Cuban comics. also is an expression of the kind of questions that these young generations of Cuban creators are asking themselves. In talking with the two creators, I noticed that they want indeed to be known in this new context, and this is one of the reasons why they wanted to use English in the comic, but also they have this this will to remain original, to remain truthful to who they are, to tell their own stories, and not to be absorbed into any kind of aspiration to commercialization or something like that. And it's a really interesting conflict that I see this pull into directions that I see it in many Cuban creators when they leave the island. And this tension in them talks about this transitional space that many Cuban creators are going through between this tension of keeping with the traditions and the culture or the homeland, but at the same time, this need to see what's beyond, to adapt and to explore new possibilities as artists, and exploring new ways of approaching how they create. So for me, these are the new weapons that Athena brings to the comic scene, this new media, this exploring new topics, new ways, new modes of interacting with the readers, new ways of approaching how comic is made by Cuban cartoonists and that are living currently outside Cuba. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to our roundtable on December 3rd.